Welcome to the Cypher After Hours. I'm Brett Stewart here with David and Emily, and we're going to continue the discussion on Satoshi and Bitcoin. Some of the stuff that we kind of left for the juicy bits in this subscriber episode is what comes next. What does the future of Bitcoin look like? Is this something where everyone's going to become a billionaire and everyone who has it is going to be the richest person on earth to happily ever after? There are no problems. Or is there something else? And my work seems to suggest that there's some trouble ahead. I think David has some work he's going to be going into. He did a 2025 Bitcoin project, which was kind of interesting. I think we're going to talk a little bit about the idea of central bank digital currencies and how that is starting to enter the mainstream. It's coming soon to a Federal Reserve near you, and how that potentially plays a role in this discussion. And then maybe some of the polarization as well. So, Emily, where do you think a good place to start, since you tasked us with this topic, would be for our work?
Well, I definitely want to get into some of the things you found about the future implications of this Bitcoin technology. I think before we jump into that, though, let's maybe revisit one of the questions that we kind of touched on in the main show, and that was, why are people so interested in Bitcoin as a technology, as almost a religion? I know we mentioned religion in the main show. I'd like to explore a little bit about how that relates to maybe a behavior that's inherent in humans themselves, how perhaps some groups might be exploiting this behavior to divide and conquer, to polarize people, because there's definitely a lot of polarization within the community and between the community and the broader public. David, do you want to lead us in with your thoughts on this particular topic?
So surely this is about the promise of getting rich quick, right? We see so many people driving their Lamborghinis around on YouTube talking about cryptos and promoting this. I mean, if they have so much money from cryptos, I don't know why they need the YouTube revenue, but anyway, that's a different question, right? So we've got the prospect of getting rich, even though rationally you can look at that and say, hey, come on, it's not very likely. You might make some money if you're lucky, but this is basically a gamble. You can have a more or less informed gamble, but people still play the lottery and really enjoy thinking about all the cool stuff they're going to do when they win, right? I do. So there's this other phenomena, which is maybe a different angle on this, which is people who are sort of towards the bottom of society, who are disempowered and don't have very much money, still often vote for political parties that, according to the historical precedent, will continue to screw them. And that is because these political parties are the same ones which give them the opportunity of screwing other people and getting rich themselves, right? So it's better to have that chance, in a way, than it is to have the certainty of a kind of middle of the road thing. It's the excitement of, maybe I'm going to get super rich off this. And that's fun in and of itself.
I would agree that that's definitely a big part of it. To be honest, I think it's probably the most significant part. Most people in crypto are there to make money. There are, however, the few righteous, religious zealots that don't view it that way. Yes, the money's nice, but they view this as their way to escape the system. That if they just have enough Bitcoin, or they have enough Ethereum, or whatever pop Dogecoin, Elon Musk's going to save us. I've had you review some Dogecoin stuff, or well, at least Elon Musk stuff. But if I just have enough, that will be my ticket. That will be my way to the moon, and I can leave all of my problems behind. And it's also, there's a fervor behind it where they just believe that this will solve the world's problems. And it's not even about money. I think there's way fewer people that are in that camp, by the way. I think it's way fewer. Most people are about making money, but you do have kind of this dichotomy. Those that just want to make money and those that are the true believers. Maximalists is what they call themselves.
I think these people, you can look at the pre-crypto days, and there is crypto anarchism, right? There's people trying to find ways to use technology to make a better future where power is decentralized. So maybe when we look at that same impetus in the context of crypto, it's kind of harder to pick that out because of all the noise and the get rich quick and it's a more noisy scene. Whereas before that, I think those people really stood alone in the literature they were producing and the software they were developing. And it never caught on because it's always too technical for the masses, right? I think that's the urge.
Well, there are people that both you and I know that would argue Bitcoin has failed already because it was intended to be a payment system to liberate people around the globe. Is it a payment system? No, it's not. It's a type of investment. It's like property. Large, huge investors have piled in with hundreds of billions of dollars and have made the value of it skyrocket. You don't use Bitcoin to go buy a cup of coffee to liberate people from the banking system. That's insane. And it doesn't work right now. It is a future goal that people would love to work that way, but it is not the way it works right now, period. It's too slow. It costs too much to run these tiny transactions on. It doesn't work that way. But there are other types of blockchains that may solve this in the future, but it's just adoption. You have an adoption problem. So I think you could actually make an argument that decentralized money up to this point has failed thus far because of an adoption problem. You could argue the reverse, but I think you could make a strong argument for that as well. And I think even the Bitcoin maximalists of the early days will say the current iteration of Bitcoin is a Frankenstein of what it should be or what they think it should be.
So one of the powers of this open source sort of programmable money is that you can actually split it off. If you don't agree with the people running a particular chain, you don't like Bitcoin, there's all these offshoots from Bitcoin. People say, I think Bitcoin should be different. There's actually nothing preventing anyone from just making what's called a fork, which is a split from Bitcoin, and just literally doing their own thing. And so you're seeing this fracturing within the community. I don't think that's just inherent in Bitcoin. It's actually inherent in open source software and open source technology that Bitcoin happens to also have these properties. But a lot of people would say, oh, well, you see, Bitcoin has failed, and therefore use my little pet alternative of the week. And it's an interesting phenomenon that we see, is that there's this fracturing in the community.
The fracturing you can, I think, view as both a positive element of freedom, but also a negative as well. Because if the society is more and more spread out in their own little crypto echo chamber, I mean, supplies obviously to other things in society that fracture off, then you have no cross communication between those who actually use the system. So what? I'm an independent company and I have to support 75 different types of payment systems because everyone has their different idea. Like, that's not going to happen. There's zero chance that's going to happen. I'm going to pick the one or two biggest and I'm going to stick with that. And so you have an adoption issue. Yes, it can work. Yes, it theoretically gives more freedom, but in practicality, does it work? Do you see the adoption? I'm yet to be converted. I'm not a believer in that.
Brett, you see, there would be people that would say, now there is this super system that they're coming up with that actually auto converts from everything to everything. So you as the consumer or the merchant don't have to support 55 things. I have the answer for you. I will auto convert and everything is supported. So it's almost like with every problem you can come up with, someone's going to try and come up with a solution, but then that's almost like this Ouroboros thing. It sort of chases itself, right? And at some point it's like, what are we doing here?
And the complexity just gets out of hand. And then I won't use that solution because it will probably be a scam and then it will fail. And then people will go, we need a new solution. I think complexity is a key thing here about that splitting off factionalization thing. There's this rule of thumb called Price's Law, which is, it says the square root of the number of employees do 50% of the work. And the reason that this emerged, this is about efficiency in large businesses. So the reason that emerges is because of the cost of communication overhead, that when you're trying to organize 1,000 people to do a task, a huge amount of your effort is spent on emails and spreadsheets and meetings and all this stuff. And it's hard work and it's expensive and it's inefficient. So actually smaller groups are more efficient, even though they can produce less, lines of code or widgets, whatever it is you're making, right? So it gets tedious and expensive, and you spend your whole time arguing once a group reaches a certain size relative to what it's trying to achieve. And one of my favorite examples of the fractioning off that happens is goths, right? We had goths, and then that got too passe. There was too many goths. And now we have cyber goths and we have like other sorts of goths. Like everything splits in that way. Like Manchester has 2 football clubs. Everything breaks up.
So the funny part about this fracturing or splitting into different groups, and then suddenly we need solutions for the fracturing and splitting into groups. This is exactly that Ouroboros. It's exactly the snake or the dragon eating its own tail. It's like, okay, yeah, have 75 different types of payment system that you all love and have the freedom to, but now we have new problems. What's the solution? The solution is the thing that everyone's running away from, is you have an oracle that will process all these other ones through it into one source to make it easy. But now you have another centralized failure point. And I think actually this idea of something that is centralized within cryptocurrencies is what shows up in the future implications of the tech as a significant problem.
Yeah. Well, what we need is a decentralized oracle, of course.
And someone's going to try and create that too. And then you have problems with that. And so it's like an around and around and around it goes. And maybe we'll solve this. I hope we will at some point. Right now, we're really just in the Wild West, though. And I think it's just so every solution we've come up with has created more problems. And there's a lot of people getting hurt along the way. So being sidelined isn't the worst idea. I mean, yeah, it's not, you can't gamble and get rich quick, but you also can't go broke.
I think we've teased the audience enough. Why don't we get into what we found in our remote viewing data about the future implications of tech? So let's just jump right in and have a look at the work that David has done on a Bitcoin session that he calls Bitcoin 2025. I believe, David, correct me if I'm wrong, but this was a year ago when you did this session?
Yeah, this was September last year. Brett tasked me on this one, and it's a long session and it's difficult to interpret because it is the state of Bitcoin on January 1st, 2025. Also describe its value and how it's used. So there's a lot of stuff crammed into here, but I did get some interesting trends out of this, which is that we have like the crypto space. We've got this energetic, dynamic, bidirectional exchange within an envelope, an unconstrained spreading. We've got all this crypto good stuff. But there is this motion, this pulling downwards that goes as a thread throughout all of the data. So from this crypto good stuff space, this pulling down first hits a very stark structure, which I've interpreted as representing regulation, old school financial authorities, governments, banks. Then we have some choppy, wild, random market movement below that. Some things stick and some things don't. And then below that, we've got what I think is hard assets, if not hard assets than traditional investments. But I think more on the hard assets, real stuff. So the idea of this is there's a flow out of the crypto space mediated by institutions and markets of capital from cryptos into hard assets for some reason. My session also describes an event, which I have done a timeline to try and place it in time. Obviously, none of this is financial advice, but I do want to caution people, my timelines are not always super accurate by any stretch. But for what it's worth, I said it's going to be a little less than 2 years from now. And this session was 13 months away. So if this turns out to be accurate, then second half of next year, we have event, which I think is what this session is describing. So it's not a total obliteration of Bitcoin, but there's this kind of calming down, motion out, regulation, swapping into different asset classes that is going on, which I think is consistent with some of the data that you've got, Brett, right?
Yeah, I was tasked with the future implications of this technology. And then out of that session work, I got an event as well. That's very similar to what you described. I have a slightly different kind of lens on it, I think. But let me describe the future implications of the tech and then lead into the event. So I believe that my work was describing it from the point of time of the tasking, which was when the white paper was released and the people, like, I think that's where I am temporally. And so the implications of the technology, I got things that were already known, which was an explosive exponential growth potential. It's also why I felt like, oh, this has been released already, and the future of this release now, which is the white paper, is massive explosion. I mean, Bitcoin's price went from pennies to $69,000. So talk about an exponential growth. So I feel a fast upward trajectory, a boom, which is fast and positive. It reminds me of something similar to AI growth increasing at an exponential rate, where something just gets smarter and smarter and smarter, except instead of intelligence, what's happening is adoption and value is getting larger and larger and larger at just insane rates. And that already occurred. We know this. I then got, however, there appears to be a hidden drawback. There is a failure that has gone unseen and unnoticed. I feel like this could be loosely referred to as, in quotation marks here, the big oops. There is an event which hasn't yet occurred. This will require some kind of externalization and eventually separating off of parts. People will look back at this and think, well, that didn't work, but the rest was great. And so there's this idea of like, hey, we made some money. We like the idea. Bitcoin was good, but it didn't work out in the way that we thought it was. I don't think is suggesting that it's going to be gone forever. I think you may have this type of phoenix kind of rising out of ashes type of thing that occurs later on. But this is just, here's my ground truth. I know these are things that already happened. So now let's look at the things that we don't know yet that I got about the future. I also got that other implications of the technology appear to regress backwards in some regards. It's somehow unwinding and spiraling past successes in other areas. It's like ripping out the walls of a house that didn't need the walls ripped out and you replaced them. It wasn't really mandatory to do this, but it happened anyway.
So when you say ripping out the walls that don't need ripping out, to me, that seems something like it's code, it's software code, right? So could it be that someone's ripping out modules within the software code or lines of code that don't need changing to try and force new code in? That's something that is regularly done in not just Bitcoin, but other crypto projects. That could be one explanation for what you're seeing, is that there's actual code changes taking place in the software.
It's definitely a good postulate. I think it could be in regards to that. I think it could also be just talking about the implications on society. Do we really need this? You have a payment system that works. Yes, people have a belief about decentralization versus centralization. Maybe there's another way. But at the end of the day, do we just end back up at centralization anyways? I think you can make an argument that we have. The primary exchange of Bitcoin is on centralized exchanges that are problematic if something happens to them. In fact, a lot more problematic than a bank. So we've gone full circle. We're right back where we started with Bitcoin. And so we've ripped out the walls of the house saying we're going to have an open space, but the open space didn't work. And then the walls have gone right back up again. So we're right back where we started. I think that's also where it's kind of, it could be the code aspects of it, but I think it's also even bigger picture of, did we even go anywhere yet with this? Or are we still in the same place? This was the idea. It wasn't really mandatory to do so, but it happened anyway. I know there will be people out there in the crypto space that will disagree with my personification of this, and that's okay. I understand that I have an opinion on this, so it's just my opinion.
There's also a lot of talk in not only the crypto space, but in broader society about some of the problems with Bitcoin in particular. Some of the other alternative cryptocurrencies have this problem too, and that's this whole notion of proof of work, where they're using up a lot of resources to run this basically lottery all the time. And is that needed? Some people argue, yes, that's the only way to go, but it's using an astronomical amount of energy. And we're entering as a society a time where, whether it's by design or by calamity or by natural forces, a big energy crunch in large parts of the world. And it's very politically and socially unpopular to just be using up all this energy. That some would argue it's worth it, but that's kind of up for debate. Do you have anything in your sessions, Brett and David, that might speak to this, about some of the problems around the energy or the electricity usage of Bitcoin?
So yes, this was actually the final implication that I got when I remote viewed the future implications of the technology. In my summary, what I wrote was, the final implication I perceived was a tremor or earthquake-like event. which is affected by the power grid of all things. In the session, I see the grid going down for a period of time. I specifically was looking in the Western Hemisphere over in the States, the United States of America. So I'm not sure what precisely causes the power failures, but it is affecting the actual technology itself, which Bitcoins run on computers. They're a specific type of machining rig for Bitcoin. It's not digging dirt. It's processing calculations, but still, it is a computer that runs. You don't have a power socket in the wall. It's not going to work. And if there is lots of power outages in the Western Hemisphere and large portions of the network are unstable consistently and go offline, that's going to cause issues. Now, I did get the idea that the technology has this ability to adapt. And I used an analogy of like being able to regrow new limbs. If something gets cut off, oh, here, the new limb is regrown. I don't know enough about Bitcoin, how that works. Maybe Emily, you know that, but it was interesting. It was like, it's going to be despair for some people, but it's going to renew itself as a result of the processes or the technology down the road. So it was a weird thing in the session, but maybe something like that exists in Bitcoin.
Yeah, so based on my research, and some of the audience probably know more of the technical details than I'm going to explain here, but it's a decentralized network with multiple nodes, so multiple computers all talking to each other. So if a say North America went offline, that might actually be even a benefit to Europe or Asia, or say Asia went offline, that would be a benefit to the other continents. So there could be the shifting of power, but it's my understanding that if a large portion of the network, the Bitcoin network, went offline suddenly, that may actually negatively affect the processing of transactions, meaning transactions would stop. And I don't want to get too technical here, but it has to do with the difficulty that scales up with the network. So this lottery, it becomes harder to win the bigger the network goes. And if the network gets small all of a sudden, the difficulty stays high for a period of time. It does readjust to come down, but it can actually grind the network to a halt. That's actually baked into the code of Bitcoin. So it's one possibility of how this might go down in the future.
So going back to the power shortages, here in the UK, the news is predicting doom and gloom that we're going to have blackouts this winter due to a shortage of natural gas to run the power stations and keep everybody warm. So, I mean, I'll put my tinfoil hat on here and say that if you were a traditional power structure, a government, a central bank, a collusion between them, and you wanted to take a brilliant opportunity to really hurt crypto that isn't under your control, then Bitcoin wasting a huge quantity of electricity in a time when people are freezing and the power's going off might be a very soft target, and one which is very appealing to the public, who might well be thinking of these crypto billionaires driving their Lamborghinis around on YouTube.
So one of the arguments that I've read about the power consumption debate, and it is a debate, you can argue both sides. One is it's using an enormous amount of power to run the network. There are other ways of running networks that use next to no power. Why is Bitcoin wasting all this energy? And one of the arguments that's floated out there is, well, what about all the energy and power and gasoline and manpower that to run a bank? You have to drive gold bars around and cash boxes, and you need to have the locks and the security and the buildings and the infrastructure of all the other things that if you compare the banking financial system, the amount of energy is required to run that, it's just as much, if not more, than what Bitcoin uses, which is a fraction of that. And so that's the argument that's used pro decentralized, pro Bitcoin. But personally, I think that is a weak argument because there are other methods out there that use next to no power and do the exact same thing. So in fact, Ethereum just made a big shift over to what's called proofs of stake, where the value in the system is run off of the actual investments that are within the system and not on this hardware of computers that is just crunching numbers nonstop, wasting electricity and causing pollution in the environment, which it turns into a political issue. And then you have a bunch of people say you shouldn't do this because to them, it appears like you're just causing pollution for no reason.
I know there's probably some people out there that might be screaming into their listening device, but David, not all the Bitcoin mining happens in the UK. It happens in such and such a sunny place and it's solar powered and so on. And I want to say to those people, it doesn't matter what the facts are, where this electricity is actually going. I think what David was getting at is the narrative could get spun in such a way as to weaponize the public against this technology. So it's very important to understand the actual on the ground truth isn't all that relevant in the context of this Hegelian dialectic, which is there's a problem, a reaction, and a solution. And I think we have some insights as to what the solution might be. But the problem reaction step in that formula is energy expensive, people cold. Reaction, look, it's the evil Bitcoin people that are to blame. Everyone weaponizes against those people in that community and that technology. And then it helps to usher in something else.
So I'm looking at the energy use estimates country by country for Bitcoin. United States is in the lead by an order of magnitude. Number 2 is Russia. So they've got all the gas that they are not exporting to Europe. They can use all the power they need to mine Bitcoin, right? Whereas Europe has no Russian gas, and Germany, France, the UK, Italy, Czech Republic, Switzerland are in the top 10, as well as a few places that are not in Europe. So if we've got Russia has all of the electricity, Brett's RV data says there's going to be power issues in the US as well. So then you've got the whole anti-Russian side, I guess, going, we've got no power. The Russians are in control of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is now a terrorist currency. It's evil, right? Just speculating.
So I think this is a perfect segue into final part of my remote viewing data that Emily had me explore, was this idea, what is this event that I loosely called, in quotation marks, the big oops? And I think that what you're describing, David, is a great postulate of an event. It's a scenario that matches. It doesn't mean it is the exact scenario that will happen, but it's the idea of a scenario like that is what my work is for forecasting. So the event I associate in the RV data with the power demand of the technology itself. I described that there is an overture or a prelude to a significant issue with the chain system. And it was at this point in the remote viewing work where immediately I was like, okay, I'm dealing with blockchain technology now, aren't I? And so I actually just wrote in session, this is like blockchain technology. So I ended up naming it here. But the rest of the work described money is being exchanged here, which is about to go through a dramatic usurpation. And so what it meant by that was usurping is wrongful or illegal encroachment, infringement, or seizure. This is related to the power draw of the system and something to do with like patents. And so it's like, who owns it? Who's running it? And I could see, I'm speculating here, but I could see the idea if the majority of the mining suddenly started occurring in Russia, that Western economies and Western politicians are going to use that as leverage to be like, this is empowering our enemy. We're going to make it illegal or make it really hard for it to be used here in the West. And then they also have the added bonus of you're also hurting the climate. And so it reinforces their narrative with their supporters and regulation comes in. And that's actually exactly what I think this is focusing on is that there is a wrongful or illegal encroachment, infringement, and possibly even seizure. In fact, I think this is actually even already happening to some extent. I think things like Coinbase, which is one of the main exchanges in the US, they confiscated funds of a lot of Russian individuals. Already, this is already happening. And so what happens when this spills out into the larger crypto space? What my work says is it gets a little bumpy.
So we have actually seen already, as Brett pointed out, that there are obviously financial sanctions against Russia. There have been these seizures of accounts that are linked to Russian interests. And then on the Russian side, you have the Russian authorities basically saying, no, we're going to accept Bitcoin. Bitcoin's going to be a nationally recognized currency in our country. It's going to be a means of exchange. So you kind of see these battle lines being drawn, and you don't have to make too many extra connect the dots from there to realize maybe how this all breaks down in the future.
Yeah, I think it's just waiting for the right domino to fall. And that's what this big oops event, I think, is describing, is that something happens, it's related to the grid, it's related to the power system, and I wouldn't be surprised with the politics around this. And that's going to be used as a motivator to seize and either make illegal or make very difficult to use Bitcoin around the globe. However, I also got the idea in this session that the cat is already out of the bag. There's going to be a concerted effort to, I use this phrase, I said, it's like there are those that don't want others to be able to move past the firewall. There's going to be an effort to actually cause havoc within the Bitcoin system. And if I put my conspiracy hat on, tinfoil, you could argue that if there are power issues on the system, that's an opportunity for players in the space, big financial organizations, governments, to actually attack their competitor, which is Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a competitor to the traditional financial system. Is that if it's having kind of these undulations that are making the network unstable, it's attacked by traditional financial institutions and governments to take it down. And I describe at some point there's an exploit like a virus that will target a single point of failure, a single node in the technological system. It's something like 20 to 40% of infrastructure loss. This is a bad actor that's centralized, which oozes of corruption and will be breached. This will infect and result in unexpected takeovers and loss, causing anomalous outcomes in the space. The end result is a long cleanup process with those that are still left over attempting to pick up the pieces. So what I believe this is saying is that at some point, there's going to be a catastrophe within the Bitcoin space. It's going to just obliterate the system. And what are the centralized nodes that we've been talking about? Well, those right now are exchanges. That would be my best bet. It might be something else, but there is this other idea that if enough of the network goes down, that those who have more Bitcoin or more processing power can start creating what's referred to as a 51% attack, that they can start posting blocks that are lies and everyone kind of agrees that they're lies. And if that occurs, that only can occur if the network is severely reduced. But that is a type of way of bringing down a system. I'm not sure that, again, I'm speculating here. I'm by no means a Bitcoin expert, but it seems like a centralized actor is going to cause dramatic problems. And we've already seen this. We've already seen centralized actors in the crypto space, like the Luna debacle, if you're familiar with it. It was an altcoin that was associated with a stablecoin. Again, I'm using lingo, but that caused a dramatic loss of wealth. Hundreds of billions of dollars just evaporated as a result. And we may see more versions of this in the future, possibly as soon as next year.
So for those listeners who don't know, when Brett was talking about exchanges, what he means is that it's almost like a bank. Even though this is a decentralized thing, you can hold your own Bitcoin in your own, you just think of it as like having it in your purse or wallet. You can also put it in an exchange, which is like putting it in a bank, but that also gets us right back to this central point of failure. And it turns out most people still find it super convenient to put all their crypto in these exchanges and keep it there. And this makes it a huge attack vector. And there have been massive exchanges in the past that have been attacked. There's a very famous incident with this exchange called Mt. Gox, and there was just, and the exchanges these days are so much larger and open to exploit that I don't know. It definitely seems to me like this could be what your data is pointing to.
So hold on, let me get this straight. People would prefer the convenience of a centralized source that they can conveniently send money to and from and buy, as opposed to spend 7 hours setting up wallets and making sure they typed in 700 keywords every time they access their money. And wait, you're telling me people value convenience over personal freedom? I think that's what the case is. Most people, at least.
Well, look at these like mega apps. Like, what's the Chinese one? They have like WeChat, but then all the financial transactions go through that same thing. And it's super convenient and it's awesome. Except it gives this huge centralized control, and now there's people scared about digital yuan and it being like negative interest rates and evaporating money that you got to spend. And people have gone, isn't this convenient? Isn't this great? Just like Facebook, everybody flocked to Facebook. It was great. And now it's absolutely god-awful, but it's the only way you can talk to your grandma in Australia. Like, the only good thing about it is because everybody's there and nobody can manage to use anything else, apparently. So, yeah, it's like a Trojan horse.
Well, you referred this idea of the money just disappearing if you don't spend it. This is something I actually tasked you earlier in this year. At least it came out. It's this idea of a central bank digital currency. And if you haven't heard about this yet, and you're at all paying attention to what's going on the global stage, you're going to hear about it eventually, because it's like having money in a bank account that goes down over time if you don't spend it, as opposed to going up and accruing interest. And I tasked you with, I don't know if we're going to mention the name. Can we mention the name here? It's after hours.
No, why don't we just call him Bob?
Well, I tasked you with Bob, and he's a big player on the world stage that is advocating for these things. And you ran this blind, and I had you look at the future of these things. What's the outcome? What's the intent? How is it being done? And you found some interesting things around these that I'm sure those who are interested in at least having a lens on the future might find useful.
Yeah, there is so much in this session. This was a blind remote viewing session, but it was monitored. So Brett and I were just on a call, and I'm reporting my data, and he's saying, move here, look at that, look at this. So that's how this session was done. So it's led to some super specific data in here. So the preamble to this is looking at the way a covert network of influence is established within politics. And I say, or maybe it's the G7 or the EU. It's like countries and banks coming together to take your money. And there's a story to this, which I've summarized as a concept. And I said, all right, concept, you tell me about yourself. And I said, oh, it's shouty. Debt, tax, demanding money, really forcefully demanding money, extracting money. You better pay me. It is debt. And then I had an AOL of the IMF playbook. No comment. So next I asked myself, who is extracting the debts? So it's this group, it's world leaders, it's international government, it's these transnational power structures. I had an AOL of Putin and also an AOL of crypto regulation at this point. I then go on to say, it's a cruel trap. There's real malicious glee about it from their point of view. Ha, we got you, and you can't escape. Who are they saying it to? It's invalid question. This is a regulation. They are forced to act. It's not beyond our control, but we had to act because we got all these media opportunities, talking heads, soapboxing, PR. It's closing off an avenue. And Brett, in your data, you had like, they want to stop people going past the firewall. I'm just rereading my session now, closing off the avenue. And then I say, it's like stopping the money leaking out. And then, this is a bit of a strange comparison. It's like Elon Musk is screwing the government for subsidies and the hole is being plugged. It's closing off something. It's good PR once, but then people are taking advantage of it. Maybe that's referring to cryptos in the public space. I don't know.
So, David, what you've just described here reminds me a little bit about what we were talking earlier, where there's this pattern that power structures like to use called the Hegelian dialectic, which is basically where they have a solution in mind. And I think you're going to get into that here in the next bit. And that's with these CDBCs, these central bank currencies. But they have a problem in that how do they get people to accept them? And there's this, just so happens there's this very wonderful, convenient target out there for them, which is Bitcoin and the crypto space, that they can basically pull the rug out from underneath Bitcoin and large parts of the crypto market. So they basically create the problem. They anticipate the reaction, which is people are freaking out. Oh my gosh, this is terrible. Look at all these people that lost their money. Look at all the power we were wasting. This is going to be the narrative I'm predicting or I'm speculating. And then they're going to come in and say, oh, well, yeah, this was a huge problem, but we have a really good solution. In fact, all of the problems that plagued the Bitcoin and the crypto space, we have an answer. If you use our central bank digital currencies, you see, we're not going to waste the power. We're not going to have this instability. We're going to step in and save the day if things like this happen. And unsavory political characters won't be able to put one over on us. So that you can see how they would spin all this to really usher in the thing that I think they're really after trying to bring into the world is these central bank digital currencies. David, do you have any data around that specifically?
I do. So this cruel trap. It says, we're coming for you. It's personalized. It's maybe everybody. You can't know where to hide. We're not surveilling. The data is already there. And I had an AOL of China's social credit score system. The cruel trap. I had an AOL here of, like, in the UK, there was a tax scandal a few years ago where the government put in place these huge tax breaks for people to invest in film production to encourage the movie industry in the UK. And all these wealthy people put loads of money into the movie industry because there were these huge tax breaks. And then they got screwed for avoiding tax. And it's like, what? I'm not even sure how that worked. Maybe it was more nuanced than that, but it did seem nuts. And it's like that, where they say, look, here's this great thing. You help us, we help you. Everything's brilliant. And then they go, you did a bad thing, and now your money is ours, and you're screwed. So I said it looks wholesome, has the blessing of the establishment. You can trust it, just like the paper with the pictures of your rulers on it. AOL Digital Yuan. Your money evaporates if you don't spend it. It's horrible, and you won't like it.
And just so everyone knows, my intent behind this tasking for David was to look at central bank digital currencies. So he's right on, he's over the target. He's right there, which is really cool to see live in a session. Unprompted, just here's a set of numbers, describe this. So that's the first point. The second point I just wanted to add in real briefly here is these are not fringe things. Central bank digital currency is not a conspiracy. This is something that has been written about by the Federal Reserve of the United States of America on many instances. So they've already talked about it. They just talked about it in one of the last Federal Reserve meetings. So this is coming, whether we like it or not. It's just how it's going to come and whether or not it's successful. And I think you got information on that. At least your information alluded to that, David, is how does this play out?
Will the cruel trap be implemented? Is it going to happen to us? And I said, it's like Agenda 2030. The stake is in the ground. So does it ever happen within 50 years, say? It meets opposition or circumstances change and it no longer works. It's like two things pushing against each other. AOL of people uprising. And then I said, commenting on my own data, I think, no, that's too obvious. But maybe it gets bogged down in bureaucracies and technicalities because it's so complex. So then we look at what's the primary blocker for this? Why doesn't it happen? There's people shouting at each other internally. There's a bunch of white papers. They haven't fully fleshed out the details. There's lobbying. It's a great idea in theory, but there's no clarity on how it will really work. So those who would implement it are confused. The people who run the nuts and bolts financial systems and governments and payment networks and what have you, who can be compelled to make this happen, are seemingly just like, we can't do it because the system isn't designed properly or completely. And they're grumpy, they're bickering between people trying to respond and integrate. So it's kind of like how here in the UK now, after the EU passed the GDPR legislation, if I try and read a local newspaper in the US, I just get a page saying, our European visitors are important to us, so you can't view this site because we can't be bothered to support GDPR requirements. It's like that. There's just this incompatibility where people are just like, nah, not doing it. So basically they make a watered down version that's a poor compromise. It's a surrogate solution. But, and I say in my data here, I'm not sure it actually does anything. It's not legislation. And then Brett's thinking, I imagine at this point, that this is such a doom and gloom financial catastrophe scenario, right? So he's wondering, is this so bad that I just am not willing to admit it to myself? So he's prompted me, is the viewer filtering this result? So I just kind of introspect a bit and ask myself, am I censoring? Would I see something different? See the future after this blockage? So we just kind of jump into the future a bit there. The compromised agreement goes on. It persists in the future. It's like they make CBDCs, but we wouldn't be forced to use them. Kind of like bonds. They exist, but not a compulsive nightmare.
I just want to add to that, actually, from what I understand of the plans that are in the works in the United States, there might be a rollout process where people's welfare or people's social programs are funded through CDBCs. So it's sort of like an optional thing. If you're dependent on the state for some sort of a benefit, you don't get cash anymore. You get this e-cash or this e-dollar that you can only spend on certain things. So once again, the things that David is reporting isn't a fringe thing. It's not a speculation. There's actually open public discussions, open public papers published on how this would get rolled out. So it would first start by replacing the social welfare programs. And in some places, it might replace all of the money. In other places, it might just be one subset of the population that's forced into this system.
So this was nearly the end of this session, and Brett hadn't asked me for any details on this individual who we'll call Bob. But at the end, somebody else chimed in and asked me to get them to describe themselves a bit and see about who this person is. And I think the individual who's asking that question was also blind to the target, which is kind of cool. So Bob is wildly head in the clouds, so divorced from real things because they just live in this other world. I say presumably wealthy, elite circles, private jets, nice restaurants. They're not grounded. They're detached from normal reality. So these ideas that they're coming up with seem sensible from their perspective when they aren't, because they've just got no idea about how things really work, that they can only design these things at such abstraction that they're not capable of producing a practical means to reach their goal. I describe Bob as nasty and paternalistic, and their idea is dumb and it won't work. It's pie in the sky. If people really tried to do this, it would harm a lot of people and it wouldn't reach its goals. So I'm quite reassured by this, that CBDCs are so bad they'll fail, hopefully.
So it makes you wonder then, if CBDCs aren't going to be as successful as the purveyors of them wish them to be, and we also see cryptocurrencies being just devastated to the point of potentially not being able to be used for a period of time, what replaces it? That's something actually maybe that we haven't really known or looked at yet, but maybe there's something else out there that's waiting just over the horizon that's better than both.
So there's a problem with fiat currencies as well, that the insane level of money printing that's been going on since the 2008 crisis, with a view to stopping the wheels falling off the whole thing, has created this inflation problem that we're now having to deal with. Central banks are between a rock and a hard place. So I don't see how we can get rid of this inflation because of the insane amount of money creation. So your fiat currency is not worth anything anymore. Your crypto is not worth anything anymore. CBDCs are not going to work. In my session on the future of Bitcoin, I describe a flow of liquidity into what I speculate may be hard assets. So perhaps we'll get the prison economy, where you go down the store and you swap like a potato and some shower gel for you pay for your childcare with packs of bootleg cigarettes. I don't know, just speculating. This is not financial advice.
So I just want to summarize for the listener what I'm hearing coming out of this narrative that Brett and David have presented to us. Basically, there's a catastrophe in the crypto space. That's what our data is showing us. That's what we're sort of speculating around. Then the replacement, which is these individuals who think they have a better system in the form of CDBCs, come in and want to replace what's been destroyed sort of in the ashes, but their system isn't really workable either. So you've got sort of one system that's destroyed by another, but then the people coming in with the better system, their thing is kind of a flaming disaster as well. The question that comes to my mind is, what's next? What rises out of the ashes of these sort of cascading calamities? And is it really about technology or specific implementations of technology, or is it more about the ideas around what is money to us, what is useful to people as a means of exchange? And I'm wondering if Brett or David, you have any thoughts on that?
Artificial intelligence. It could possibly be something in the future where we just aren't aware of the right parameters for what could happen. Something like artificial intelligence might table flip everything, including the financial system, cryptocurrencies, money, the entire way we think about exchange, due to the advent of real artificial intelligence, would make us not even able to ask the right questions. So why is it that we don't see anything? Well, maybe we need to look a little bit harder to see, well, what's beyond that horizon, and maybe we'll be able to describe it. But I think something like that is a interesting hypothesis.
So basically a paradigm shift, like just our questions we're asking about these things don't make sense because by the time we get there, we're in a sort of a new way of thinking about all these things anyway, and we can't even really imagine what that's like from the present moment.
I think it's possible.
I hope so, because I think our current trajectory is doomed. Since late 70s, early 80s, as part of the great neoliberal experiment, the money has been getting more and more broken in the process of it getting more and more concentrated with the very wealthy. So we're going to need a big change to put that right. So let's hope we don't have to have too many iterations before we find a solution which works.
Thank you for joining us in After Hours. It was fun exploring a more technical subject. Some of our past remote viewing data has been a little bit more esoteric or ancient history. We kind of went to something a little bit more modern in this one, and I think that's what really our plan is just to kind of have a wide range of things that people are interested in, that we're interested in, and this is definitely a very relevant one for a lot of people, myself included. So thank you for joining us, though, on this Cypher adventure. If you enjoyed this episode, definitely share it with your friends. We also would really love if you give us a 5-star review over on Apple or Spotify podcasts. And be sure to tune in next time where we explore the next mystery. And you'll just have to tune in to find out what that is. All right, everyone, take care. We'll see you next time.